The Dentalpreneur Podcast. Okay, doctor, it's time to put down that handpiece. You're listening to the show dedicated to helping dentists get their lives back. It's time to decrease your stress, increase your profitability, and regain your passion. Now introducing your host, Dr. Mark Costas.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Dentalpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Costas. What is up, my friends? I hope you're doing great out there in podcast land. You're in for a treat today because we have a multiple-time guest on the podcast today, somebody who I respect very, very much in his area of expertise. He's a good friend. Let's welcome back to the podcast, Chip Fichtner, founder and principal of Large Practice Sales. He's built, bought, and sold multiple companies, both public and private, in a variety of industries for 40 plus years. He's been featured on numerous media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and CNBC. Welcome to the podcast, buddy. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, listen, I don't want to get all political on you here, but just to mark this in time, we're about a week post-election, and I just wanted to ask, without getting political, like I said, if you think that there's going to be any substantial differences in private equity markets and what it is that you and I do for a living as far as transitioning dental practices and private equity and things like recaps, interest rates, all that stuff. What's your reflections?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think it's probably generally all good. It's all good in the fact that we had in the last 2 weeks, 2 invisible dental support organizations complete recapitalizations. One of those was the largest recapitalization in history, where they valued their group at close to $4 billion. And over 700 doctor partners had the opportunity to monetize a part of their retained ownership. Fortunately, over 50 of those were our clients, so very happy. And some of our clients are participating in their second recapitalization with this particular group. So that sets a great tone for what's going on in the country as far as recapitalizations of these groups, which is often a big piece of why doctors join them. And, I think the fear of Biden's proposed 44.6% tax rate federal on the sale of an interest or all of your practice, that specter is gone because I don't think Trump would let that happen. So I think that's a good thing because the other candidate had come out and endorsed Biden's position on that, which means that doctors who monetized a part of their practice under that proposal would have been facing state and federal tax loads approaching 60% in California and New York. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, that is gone. I think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I think, from the investor world, contrary to popular belief, all of the invisible DSOs are not backed by private equity. Certainly many are, but there are a number of them that today are backed by family offices, sovereign wealth funds. And most people don't know that the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, owns 2 invisible DSOs. And so I think the removal of the carried interest tax treatment for the principals of all of these groups is a good thing because both during Obama and Biden, they have been pressing to take away that, as they call it, loophole. And I think that's going to make the big investors very happy. So overall, I think pretty much everything that's happened is a good thing.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that bit of clarity. I wanted to ask, moving back, if you talk to people, there's a contingent out there that is anti-selling to DSOs ever. And I think that when you're dealing in absolutes, I think that's kind of a mistake to begin with, and it's overgeneralization. And I think there's nuance to business and to certain people's situations. But if you were to get in kind of a debate with some of these people, many of them have said, hey, listen, if you look back, there's been so many recaps that have failed, and we don't believe in recaps in general, or if there is a recap, it's few and far between. I've heard those sorts of things. And I've also heard people on that side say things like, hey, listen, if you have, an X valuation, all you're doing is prepaying yourself for X number of years and you're going to go back and you're not going to have any autonomy, blah, blah, blah. There's a number of different things that we could talk about as far as their points, as far as why you should never get involved with the DSO or sell to anybody other than a doctor or a pair of doctors. So what would you say to those types of arguments when you're looking at a DSO versus a non-DSO sale side by side?
Well, the valuation differences between an invisible DSO partnership and selling doc to doc are dramatically different. In a typical doc to doc transaction, you might get 70% of collections as a value, and in some cases, you might get as high as 100% of collections. In my world, we do very few transactions at less than 150% of collections. And in the last 90 days, we've completed transactions at 3 times collections. So first thing is you should understand that because the value differential is dramatic if you have a practice that qualifies to become an invisible DSO partner, and not all practices will. Generally speaking, you need to have at least $500,000 of EBITDA or operating profit after paying the doctor, which many of your CPAs forget to do. You got to pay the doctor first before you calculate EBITDA. But the answer is all of the negative fears that doctors have heard about these transactions are true. These people aren't making up the problems that they've had with traditional DSOs or with the invisible DSOs. The reality is you have to choose wisely. There are over 1,000 invisible DSOs and DSOs in the U.S. today.
Wow.
We consider less than 100 of those qualified to bid on our clients. And those 900 that are not qualified to bid are not qualified for a variety of reasons, ranging from the type of practices that they have partnered with historically, their capital structure, who their investor is, what that investor's track record is, and do they live up to their promises? One of the key issues that we face with doctors every day is, will I lose my autonomy? And that is a very fair question. So you have many of these groups talking about autonomy, and they call it clinical autonomy, which basically means we're going to let you continue to make the clinical decisions, but we're going to take over everything else. We don't deal with those groups. Our doctors are promised full autonomy and they get full autonomy. In other words, an invisible DSO is not going to try to homogenize a practice or micromanage it, the right invisible DSO. Mm-hmm. And so when you choose wisely, the upside in these things has been proven again. Last week, close to $4 billion of recapitalizations. So the other thing that's shifted is as doctors come to realize that the invisible DSOs are different from selling out to a traditional DSO. Mm-hmm. We've had a huge shift in the types of doctors that are partnering with invisible DSOs using us. So we've done about $1 billion of these partnerships in the last 24 months. And of that, 150 million have been for doctors in their 30s, which is shocking. Did not happen that way pre-COVID. But the reason younger doctors are becoming interested in an invisible DSO partnership is because they can help growth. The invisible DSOs are paying 25 to 30% less for supplies. They're paying 50% less for implants. They're paying 30% less for clear aligners. And most importantly, they're getting reimbursed at higher rates from payers than independent doctors are. We did a deal this year where we had a $4 million in collections client, all insurance, and his new partner is getting reimbursed at 20% higher rates than he was. So as he joined that group, he saw his revenues increase by 20%, all of which fell directly to the bottom line, just because his new partner had 33 practices in his region and had been able to go to the insurance companies and go, look, if you want us to take care of your covered insureds, you're going to have to pay us more. And so as the younger doctors have become to realize that the invisible DSOs are eager for growth, they're willing to finance growth, and they're willing to let the doctor continue to do whatever he or she has done successfully, they're going to leave him alone, give him the resources to grow. And it's a great way to build an empire with no risk, because, you could do a deal where you sell 51% of your practice for cash up front at today's 20% federal tax rates. Thank you. And yet retain 49% ownership in the practice and use your partner's capital to go grow, add other offices, buy competitors, do whatever you want. And these are all plans that are laid out up front, not negotiated later. Yeah. So big shift in what I'll call the education of doctors. Historically, have there been problems? Sure. When you choose the wrong invisible DSO, you're going to have problems. And there are, in my view, 900 invisible DSOs out there and DSOs that are not qualified to bid on our clients. And so you got to be really careful. There's a whole lot of promises. There's a lot of happy talk. There's dinners and drinking and referrals from other doctors who are with the group that you're considering. And, in our view, you need to have multiple bidders so you can choose the right partner because they're all different.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Chip. Listen, when we're talking about this contingent of doctors that you're alluding to that are in their 30s, there seems to be a lot that are in their mid to late 30s, early 40s that are selling their practice, which is skewing much younger than it has in past generations. When those doctors are going into something like an arrangement with an invisible DSO, what they're hoping for is a recap and a good multiple on that recap, and then hopefully multiple recaps. So what are some of the variables that go into vetting an invisible DSO? I know that there's people like you out there that are there to help guide people and counsel people to select the right ones. But what are we looking for as far as a DSO that has a likelihood of getting a favorable multiple on a recap and having multiple recaps moving forward? Because that means a lot to those younger docs.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the reason the younger docs do these transactions is because when you choose wisely, the upside can be staggering. Mm-hmm. In that multi-billion-dollar recap last week, we partnered one of our clients with them when they had about 50 offices. And 38 months after we partnered him with them, they had grown to 240 offices. And they did their second recapitalization, which he could have participated in. He did not. He kept his equity. And so his initial deal was he kept $2 million of equity. And last week, he could have liquidated that $2 million in equity for somewhere north of $16 million. Wow. So an 8 times return in less than 7 years. Not bad.
Not bad.
And he was 38 at the time. And today he's old. He's 45. But the key is choosing the right group, and it's not just the management of the group. It's really important that you look at the money behind it. One of our clients, a GP in Nashville, in the second quarter became the platform practice for a brand new invisible DSO. He was number one. And the reason we suggested this was a good thing for him was because the money that was forming this new invisible DSO has done it 5 times before. They've started, built, and monetized 5 invisible DSOs over the last 10 years. And so in our view, that was a relatively low risk trade for him to become a platform, to become number one, because he had a proven group of investors and management team that had done it before, not just once, but 5 times. And so that's one of the key criteria when you look at these groups is how are they financed and who are they financed by? There's many of them that are trying to do this using bank debt alone without a sophisticated investor, and that's tough. Mm-hmm. And the investor that you have is very important. We look for invisible DSOs where the investors have not only done multi-site healthcare consolidation, whether that's vet or behavioral health or ophthalmology or cardiovascular, but we look for invisible DSOs that are backed by groups that have done other invisible DSOs. And there are multiple ones out there. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to look at the strategy of the management. What's their growth plan? What types of doctors are they partnering with? Which is a really interesting flag. When you see an invisible DSO partnering with someone that we decline to represent, that's a big red flag to say this is not necessarily a group that we want our clients to go with when they have chosen poorly in the practices that they've already partnered with. So it's important to understand that. Obviously the financing that they have available to drive growth is critical. And that financing is very rarely bank financing. The larger invisible DSOs don't go to the bank when they need capital for growth. They go to investors and they go to private credit markets. So understanding what the financing available is for future growth is critical, because the groups that are going to have successful recaps are the groups which have not only grown through new partnerships, but in which their resources have helped their new and existing partner practices create organic growth. Organic growth, not just in the top line, but organic growth in the bottom line or the EBITDA number. So the big one that just recapitalized last year, their average practice out of over 700 practices had a growth in their EBITDA of 5%. And that's been a little tough to do because they happen to be the second largest owner or partners with orthodontists. And the orthodontist world has been hit with 3 consecutive years of declining case starts. So even though this group was the second largest owner of orthodontic practices in the US after number 1, which is Smile Doctors, this particular group across the average of their practices had increased EBITDA by 5%. Very tough to do. And that's what investors and recaps are looking at is, have you grown through partnerships? That's good. But if your support has not generated growth at the top and bottom line levels for your partner practices, you're going to have a tough time doing a recap, because if management's not adding value to the partner practices, you haven't really created anything that demands a high multiple in a recapitalization.
Good stuff. I'm embarrassed that I hadn't heard that statistic. I was unaware that ortho specialty had declined over the last few years. Do you attribute that to GPs getting more sophisticated with their clinical suite and more of that stuff falling on general practitioners versus specialists?
That's one of the arguments. There are a number of arguments, but here are the numbers. So 22 versus 21, you had an 8% case start drop, and I'm talking national average here. 23 versus 22, you had a 6% case start drop. And 24 versus 23, we're looking at about a 5% drop. So it's the first time we've had 3 consecutive years of ortho case start drops. Now, here's what some people attribute it to. Number one, yes, are more GPs using Invisalign and the other clear aligner products to eat into the specialty ortho practice volume? Yes, definitely. Number two, part of the 22 versus 21 drop is attributed to the fact that everybody came out of COVID, they had cash, so 21 was abnormally high.
Makes sense.
So that's one of them. The other interesting theory, one of the CEO of one of the largest ortho-only invisible DSOs was over at my house a couple of weeks ago. And we were talking and he said, I've got a theory for you. I was like, what's that? He said, well, adult orthodontics is based on the adults having disposable income to do something good for themselves. I'm like, okay, I'll buy that. And we go back and look at 08, 09. And practices with adult ortho got crushed, right? Because straightening your teeth as an adult is one thing. You're going to find the money to get your kids' teeth straight early, but it's functionally optional for adults to do it later. So we had a disaster in 08, 09 in the ortho business. So his theory was that with the advent of Ozempic and Mounjaro and the other miracle weight loss drugs, that the disposable income was going to make you thinner rather than make your smile better. And that the spend on the GLP drugs was taking business away from ortho. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But adult ortho is very economically sensitive. Kid ortho less so. And the other thing is you've had, while case starts have declined, revenues have not declined as precipitously because you've had price increases. The average ortho case cost has gone up probably 25% in the last 4 years. And the average fee has gone up probably something closer to 15 to 20%. So while you've had case start drops, that's to some degree been offset by higher case fees. And at some point, higher case fees become a problem as to affordability for ortho, not just for adults, but also for kids. So I think there's some interesting changes there. And again, not to get too far off on ortho, but any of the high dollar dental procedures, all on X, for instance, all on X has been hurt due to higher interest rates and lower approval rates as lenders have tightened up. And so you've got all on X is at risk of the same thing that ortho has had. It's an expensive procedure. It's an optional procedure. And, at least the orthodontist will finance it at no interest for their patients, whereas the all on X guys may not. And the all on X is a much bigger ticket, obviously.
Yep. Understood. So from a private equity perspective, or a DSO perspective, however you want to look at it, are groups of specialties more or less attractive than groups of GPs?
I think they're both attractive. Some of it is driven by geography. We've had an interesting shift in geographic desires in that if you go back to 23, the hot states were Florida, Tennessee, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Idaho. Utah, Idaho have gotten hotter because their populations are growing. Mm-hmm. But whether it's specialty or GP, there are plenty of bidders out there for both of them. And we've seen in the first half of 24 there was over $5 billion invested in the invisible DSOs. That's a lot of capital, and fortunately, that offset the decline in the bidding from the groups that were hurt by higher interest rates. A lot of doctors are under the perception that high interest rates, political nonsense, wars, et cetera, have hurt practice values. But that's not true. Just last quarter, we did almost $200 million of these partnerships. 55 million was done at 11 times EBITDA, a new record for us for something that big. It was about a 5 million in EBITDA grew. And another 60 million were done at 9 times EBITDA or better. And we did nothing at under 7 times EBITDA. So if you have a great practice that's growing, you're in a relatively good geography. One of our highest value deals last year was done in Michigan. The 9X deal was done in New York State. So there's a lot of interest if it's the right practice. The key to value, not only for a recap, but for the initial value of a practice is today, number one thing, did you grow in 24 versus 23? Mm-hmm. And how fast did you grow? And it's not just top line revenues, it's bottom line.
Yep. Got it. Awesome. So you were talking about one of your doctors that passed on taking advantage of the recap from a cash perspective. What are some of the deal structures that you've seen where you can reinvest a portion or all of your equity that you have, retained equity that you have, versus pulling it off the table? So do you understand my question? I don't know if I'm...
I mean, doctors will typically have the opportunity in the recapitalizations to liquidate all or part of their equity.
Thank you. Yep.
It'll depend on the invisible DSO that they're partnered with. It'll depend on the new investor, and it'll also depend on their age. Mm-hmm. In some of these groups, they're letting doctors that are over 55 liquidate all of their equity if they want to. And doctors under 55 are limited to liquidating maybe half of their equity. Okay. And again, you don't know, and you don't get to negotiate that up front when you choose a deal that's based on a recapitalization. We do many deals for doctors who say, look, the mythical recapitalization is great, but I'm 55 and I want to know that I'm going to be able to get out at some point at a set date and time. How do you do that? Well, the answer is we structure plenty of transactions where the doctor has the ability to force their partner to buy their retained equity with a certain amount of notice at a set date and time in the future. Mm-hmm. And that limits the doctor's exposure to both the upside of the recapitalization, but it also limits the doctor's exposure to the risk of no recapitalization. Mm-hmm. They always have a way out, a trap door, which we think is important, especially for older doctors. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about older doctors, that's another interesting phenomenon, because so many younger doctors today are eagerly participating in invisible DSO partnerships that it's squeezing the value of older doctors. Mm-hmm. And I'm 64, so I can pick on old guys. But today, a 64-year-old single doc practice is going to have a tough time getting a high value. When we run into a high-producing 60-something doctor, our first step with him is to find him or her an associate. Because that associate is the future of the practice. Because the reason the invisible DSOs pay higher values than a doc-to-doc transaction is because they're buying the doctor. The doctor and his future are really valuable to the DSO, which is why young doctors will command higher values than old doctors. And that's, again, been a big shift post-COVID. So if you're 55 or older, you need to have a plan. You need to start working on it today, not 5 years from now when you have that evil 6 in front of your age.
Yeah. Yeah. The evil 6 used to be primarily the people that were transitioning were the evil 6 and above. Now it's just such an interesting world that people with the 3 and 4s are selling. Chip, philosophically speaking, you are on the other side of this, right? You are one of the main drivers, big player in this transition kind of phenomenon that's happening inside dentistry. Do you think that it's good for the profession or bad? Or what do you think about consolidation in general? And what's your prognostication on percentages now versus in the not too distant future?
Well, that's an interesting discussion because historically, many independent doctors would say, oh, corporate DSOs are evil and they're going to give me quotas and tell me how to do things and what products to use. And you know what? That's true. Some of the big DSOs, not invisible DSOs, but the big ones, will attempt to homogenize their practices, tell their practices what to do. Here's the playbook. This is what we're going to do. These are the products you're going to use. These are the labs you're going to use. And that's challenging for many doctors. And historically, if I'm a 60-year-old doctor and I sell 100% to a DSO and I agree to work for the next 3 years as an employee, that can be very painful because you now have gone from being an entrepreneur to being an employee with somebody telling you what to do. Fortunately, with the invisible DSO transactions, that's not what happens. And that is why the invisible DSOs got $5 billion in the first half of this year. And the DSOs, the traditional branded command and control DSOs, did not get $5 billion in the first half of this year. So as far as, long term, the larger groups are able to get buy things cheaper. They're able to innovate new technologies. You look at any of the big DSOs or invisible DSOs, they have all implemented AI in their diagnostic procedures, whereas less than 5% of the independent dentists across the country have not. Or excuse me, only less than 5% of the independent dentists have implemented AI in their diagnostic procedures. Mm-hmm. So these groups are actually able, thanks to their size, to provide better care at lower cost. And that's going to be a growing chasm as they get bigger and they get more muscle with the insurance companies, because when a new technology comes out that could be beneficial for patient care, I promise you the big guys are the first ones that test it, prove it, and make sure that the numbers show that, hey, this is not only better patient care, it's more profitable for us. There is not a correlation between better care and profitability, but shockingly, that's how it turns out. So, as far as consolidation goes, it's not for every doctor. There are plenty of independent dentists that are going to survive and thrive in the coming years, but the majority of the dentists will ultimately join an invisible DSO or compete with many. That's the thing. I always urge doctors to call me. Let's have a conversation, and I'll tell you what's happening in your community. And you need to understand that these groups can be fierce competitors, mm-hmm. and they may be offering Invisalign at $29.95, and you're trying to do it at $49.95 or $59.95. Well, they're paying $600 for that lab fee, and you're probably paying $1,400 for that lab fee. And so these groups are going to drive consolidation. The challenge is that the average GP in the U.S., according to the ADA, did about $800,000 in collections in 23. And that is not a practice that will be consolidated by the DSOs or the invisible DSOs because they make no profit. If you have an $800,000 practice, and once they pay you a going rate of 30 to 35% of collections for what you do every day, your business, once it pays the expenses, is not a business, it's a job. And so while people say, well, the MD business is consolidated at 77%, dental will get there, I don't agree with that, because I think there are a number of practices that will never be consolidated because they don't qualify to be consolidated. And we're seeing more and more graduates from the dental schools joining the invisible DSOs or DSOs. So the startups of new practices are declining. And I think that points to consolidation will continue and will continue faster.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So what's the playbook then for emerging newish invisible DSOs to mid-sized DSOs to become the most attractive to private equity buyers in a recap cycle? What are the factors? They're looking for same-store growth. They're looking for a certain amount of EBITDA purchasing power growth. What is the perfect formula to make sure that you're attractive to recap in the recap cycle?
It's there are a lot of different formulas that have been successful and enabled groups to recapitalize, but a lot of it is based on the doctor quality that they partner with. There are groups out there that are not well run and not well financed that are partnering with what I'll call lower quality doctors, and many of them are not in attractive geographies. There have been several invisible DSOs that have grown because they could buy their practices or partner with practices cheaper, went into rural areas. And they subsequently found that as the original doctor aged out, it was very, very difficult to replace them. And so the groups that have gone into less than desirable geographies have had problems. That's not new. That's been happening for a decade. The theory is, hey, I can partner with a practice at a lower initial value because they're 2 hours from a commercial airport. Now, that strategy backfired because you couldn't replace the doctors as they retired out. So you have several groups that followed that strategy that ultimately will never recapitalize. So you've got to look at what the strategy of the invisible DSO has been, where are they going, and how old are the doctors they're partnering with. Some of these groups, again, because they could get them less expensively, have partnered with practices with older doctors. And that's not a recipe for success. If you want longevity and value in your invisible DSO, you need to be able to convince younger doctors in growing geographies to join your group. Whether that's Florida or Tennessee or Texas or whatever. Growing geographies are important. And there are places that grow that aren't necessarily there. We did a bunch of transactions in Albany, New York this year. And Albany, New York is the state capital of New York. And so it's never going to run out of money and it's never going to stop growing. So it's not just state specific. It's you can be in a growing economy that's not in a growing state, and therefore your practice still has value. But the key is looking at who the doctors are, where the doctors are, and is the invisible DSO adding value to their doctor partners?
Good stuff. All right. So I have lots of discussions with dental students and young docs many times just after they've purchased a practice. And one of the things that makes things challenging from the seat that I sit in is talking to docs or dental students that have gotten involved with a deal that I would see as less than optimal for their future ability to sell, and their future ability to recap and to attract multiple providers, et cetera. So I see docs all the time that are picking up a 4-operatory practice with no room for expansion in maybe more of a rural area because they got a good deal on it. Cash flow is good. But they're going to be stuck. So what are some of the things that you would tell younger doctors, maybe D4 dental students or younger doctors that are going out and looking for practices to acquire? What's on the checklist to make their future transition more successful?
I think the most important thing is to have a plan and to understand what your goals are. Some doctors are very happy and make a great income working 3 days a week, and they're young and they've got a 30-year time horizon, and going into a rural area and partnering or buying a practice in a rural area is not all that bad if you've got a 30-year time horizon, because you're going to make a great living in a great area for 30 years. Ultimately, that practice value will not be the same as if you had bought it in a suburban area in a growing state, in a growing city. You went to Dallas versus Des Moines. Would you pay more in Dallas than a suburb of Des Moines? Yeah, probably. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to build a $5 million practice and you have the talent and the access to the capital to do that, fantastic. But there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I'm going to go into a fabulous rural area where I know my family is going to be happy growing up for the next 30 years. I'm not going to be able to build a $5 million practice in a town of 25,000 people, but that may not be the goal, right? Many people get into dentistry, in my opinion, because of the lifestyle it offers, right? In my lifestyle, I work 80 hours a week, but there are plenty of people who get to work 25 hours a week or 30 hours a week, and they have a real life. There's nothing wrong with either approach, but they're different. So I think the number one thing that a graduate coming out should understand is do a whole lot of self-reflection and figure out, what do I want to do with my life? What are my goals? Do I want to build a $5 million practice or a $20 million practice? Or am I looking for a lifestyle? And do I want to move to a place where my kids will be happy and they're great schools and we can go fishing every weekend? So I think stage of a doctor's career, and that will drive what they do, because sometimes it makes more sense to pay a higher number for a practice in Nashville or Dallas or Austin or Orlando, because if your goal is to build a big practice, you're going to have a better chance of doing that than in a rural area of Minnesota. And you got to understand what you want.
Yep. Great answer, Chip. Well, as we kind of close up here, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you or your company, and what's the process if people are interested in finding out if they are a good target for an invisible DSO to transition?
So largepracticesales.com, you can reach us, and there's plenty of information there, but I urge every doctor, let's have a conversation. What I always tell doctors is we provide free education because my goal personally is for every doctor in the country to at least understand the invisible DSO option, because the great majority of them still don't. They still associate it with the traditional DSOs of buy 100% and work in pain for 3 years and then retire. The reality is when you understand invisible DSOs, it can either help you understand why you want to or do not want to partner with an invisible DSO, but you at least understand them because they're coming to your community, and you ultimately are going to join one or compete with many. So you ought to at least understand them. So largepracticesales.com. And I'm happy to have a conversation with any doctor and help them understand this option. It's not for everybody, but everybody should understand it.
Awesome. Well, Chip, as always, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to help educate our audience. You always have some insights. I always learn every time that I talk to you. Looking forward to our next conversation. Congratulations on all of your success in the trailing 12 months and many more successes moving forward.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Ladies and gentlemen, founder and principal of Large Practice Sales, Chip Fichtner.